The police lights flashed across the water like a warning flare, red and blue rippling over the calm lake as if the surface itself was being accused of something. I stood there with my fishing rod still in my hand, line cast, heart steady, while a patrol car rolled to a stop behind me. That was the moment I knew this wasn't going to be a normal afternoon. I hadn't broken a rule. I hadn't crossed a fence. I was simply fishing. Yet someone had decided that this quiet, ordinary act deserved a 911 call, flashing sirens, and armed officers demanding answers. It started less than an hour earlier, when I pulled my truck up to the gravel edge of the lake, the same place I'd parked dozens of times before. The sun was high, the water glassy, and the bass were biting. This lake wasn't hidden or secret, but it was surrounded by expensive homes and manicured lawns, the kind of neighborhood where people assumed they owned more than they actually did. I baited my hook, cast my line, and settled into the peaceful rhythm that only fishing gives you. That peace didn't last long. I noticed her first from the corner of my eye. A woman standing on a nearby dock, arms crossed, phone already in her hand. She didn't wave. She didn't ask a question. She stared at me like I'd just parked on her living room couch. I could tell exactly what was coming, because I'd seen that look before. 10 minutes later, I heard the distant wail of sirens growing louder, cutting through the quiet like a blade. When the officers stepped out, they approached cautiously, hands resting near their belts. One of them asked the question everyone expects in moments like this, "Sir, do you know why we're here?" I answered calmly, because I truly didn't. They explained that the HOA had reported a trespasser illegally fishing on private property. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I set my rod down and listened as they told me I needed to leave immediately. That's when I said the sentence that froze the entire scene in place, "Officers, this lake is mine." Their expressions shifted, confusion replacing authority, and I knew this call was about to become something no one expected. The officers exchanged a quick glance after I said it, the kind that happens when something doesn't fit the script they were given. One of them cleared his throat and asked me to repeat myself. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply said it again, slowly this time, as if clarity alone might reset the situation. This lake belongs to me. Behind them, the HOA woman had stepped closer, clearly irritated that the conversation wasn't going the way she expected. She interrupted before the officers could respond, insisting that I was lying. According to her, the lake was community property, reserved exclusively for residents and guests approved by the association. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged before, the kind of confidence that comes from years of people backing down rather than pushing back. One officer turned back to me and asked for identification. I handed it over without hesitation. He studied it carefully, then radioed it in. While we waited, the other officer asked how long I'd been fishing there. I told him the truth. Years. Long before the HOA existed. Long before the homes around the lake were built. That seemed to irritate the woman even more. She scoffed and accused me of trying to intimidate the police with a fake story. She went on and on about HOA rules, property boundaries, and fines for unauthorized access. She even claimed they had signage proving the lake was private. I asked her calmly where those signs were. She pointed vaguely toward the far side of the water, though none were visible from where we stood. The officers noticed too. Silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable. The radio crackled, pulling everyone's attention back to the present. Dispatch confirmed my identity, but that wasn't the end of it. The officer asked if I had documentation proving ownership of the lake. I smiled, not out of arrogance, but because I'd expected this exact moment. I told them the deed was recorded with the county and that the lake was listed as part of a much larger land parcel. I even mentioned the file number, something the HOA woman clearly hadn't anticipated. Her confidence wavered. She crossed her arms tighter, repeating that the HOA's lawyer had assured them the lake belonged to the community. That statement was the first real crack in her story. Lawyers don't assure things casually, and officers know that. One of them asked dispatch to verify the property records. As we waited, the woman muttered about entitled people and outsiders. I watched the lake instead, calm and unbothered, knowing the truth had a way of surfacing, just like the biggest fish always do. The wait felt longer than it probably was, the kind of pause where everyone starts replaying their own words in their head. The officers stood quietly, radios clipped to their shoulders, eyes shifting between me, the woman, and the water. The HOA woman kept tapping her phone against her palm, irritation written all over her face, as if impatience alone could rewrite reality. Finally, the radio crackled again. Dispatch's voice came through clearer this time, more deliberate. They confirmed the parcel number I had given matched a large tract of land registered under my name. That land, according to county records, included the lake in its entirety. Not part of it. Not shared access. The entire lake. The officer nearest to me raised his eyebrows and asked dispatch to repeat that last part. When they did, the tone of the scene shifted completely. Authority no longer pointed in one direction. The HOA woman immediately protested, claiming there had to be a mistake. She insisted the HOA paid for maintenance, landscaping, and even stocked the lake with fish. The officer responded with something simple but devastating: maintenance doesn't equal ownership. I explained, calmly, that the lake predated the neighborhood. When developers approached me years ago, they bought surrounding plots but never the water. The agreement was clear, recorded, and legally binding. The HOA existed because the development existed, not the other way around. The woman scoffed, but her voice lacked the certainty it had earlier. One officer asked why, if I owned the lake, the HOA believed otherwise. I told him the truth. Assumptions. Somewhere along the line, someone decided that because the lake was beautiful and central to the neighborhood, it must belong to everyone. That assumption became tradition. Tradition became policy. And policy, unchecked, became entitlement. The officers nodded. They'd seen this before, just not on this scale. Dispatch added one more detail that made the air feel heavier. The assessed value of the land, including the lake, was estimated at over $8 million. I didn't say anything when that number was spoken out loud, but the HOA woman's face drained of color. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. This was a catastrophic error. She tried to recover, saying the HOA had legal documentation too. The officer asked to see it. She couldn't. Emails weren't deeds. HOA bylaws weren't county records. Belief wasn't ownership. The silence that followed was no longer tense. It was final. The officer turned to me and apologized for the inconvenience. Then he turned to her and explained, politely but firmly, that calling the police on a property owner for using their own land could have consequences. I picked up my fishing rod again, not to make a point, but because the moment had passed. The truth had surfaced, and the lake was calm once more. The apology from the officer hung in the air longer than the sirens had earlier, heavier because it carried consequences no one had anticipated. The HOA woman opened her mouth as if to argue again, but no sound came out. Her confidence had fully collapsed, replaced by the realization that the situation was no longer under her control. The officers weren't here to enforce HOA rules anymore. They were here to document a mistake. One of them asked her directly who authorized the call. She hesitated, then admitted she was acting on behalf of the HOA board. That admission changed everything. The officer explained that filing a false report, even unintentionally, could lead to legal trouble, especially when it resulted in an armed police response. Her eyes widened. This had started as an attempt to assert authority. It was rapidly turning into liability. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. The facts were finally doing the talking for me. The officers asked if I wanted to press the issue further. I told them not at that moment. I wasn't interested in revenge. I wanted clarity. What happened next would take care of itself. The HOA woman tried to shift tactics, suddenly polite, asking if we could talk this out privately. I declined. Ownership isn't a negotiation, and boundaries don't need discussion once they're established. The officers agreed and suggested she contact the HOA's legal counsel immediately. They also advised her to stop enforcing any rules related to the lake until ownership was formally reviewed. That alone felt like an earthquake under the neighborhood's assumptions. As the officers prepared to leave, more residents had gathered, drawn by the lights and commotion. Whispers spread quickly. People pointed at the water, then at me, then back at the woman. The story was already changing, reshaping itself in real time. What had been a trespasser caught fishing was becoming the guy who owns the entire lake. I watched as the HOA woman retreated, phone pressed to her ear, voice urgent now instead of arrogant. The officers shook my hand before leaving, one of them quietly saying he'd never seen an HOA mistake this big before. I believed him. When the patrol cars disappeared, the lake returned to its stillness, but the neighborhood didn't. Doors closed softly. Conversations buzzed. People realized something fundamental had shifted. For years, they'd treated the lake as a shared amenity. Barbecues, paddle boats, dock parties, all built on an assumption that no one had ever bothered to verify. I cast my line again, the ripples spreading gently across the surface. I knew this wasn't over. That phone call had set something in motion far bigger than a ruined afternoon of fishing. The HOA had just discovered that confidence without paperwork is a dangerous thing, and I had a feeling their next call wouldn't be to the police. The next morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Missed calls, voicemails, and text messages stacked up faster than I could read them. Neighbors who had barely acknowledged me before suddenly wanted a quick conversation. The HOA board requested an emergency meeting, stressing the word emergency like it might undo what had already happened. I didn't respond right away. There was no rush. The truth wasn't going anywhere. By that evening, the neighborhood clubhouse was packed. Cars lined the street, and people stood in small clusters, whispering theories and half-formed explanations. I arrived quietly and took a seat near the back. The HOA board sat at the front, faces tight, folders spread across the table as if paperwork alone could save them. The same woman who had called the police sat stiffly, avoiding eye contact. The meeting started with routine formalities that fooled no one. Everyone was there for one reason. Finally, the HOA president cleared his throat and addressed the issue directly. He said there had been a misunderstanding regarding lake ownership. That word misunderstanding floated in the air, fragile and insufficient. A resident immediately stood up and asked how an HOA could misunderstand ownership of the neighborhood's centerpiece. No one answered. The board's lawyer spoke next, choosing words carefully. He confirmed that county records showed the lake was privately owned. Mine. He explained that while the HOA had maintained the shoreline and funded recreational activities, none of that transferred legal ownership. Gasps rippled through the room. Some people looked angry. Others looked embarrassed. A few looked afraid. Questions exploded from every direction. What about the docks? The fishing tournaments? The paddle boats? The annual summer festival on the water? The lawyer answered honestly. None of those activities were authorized by the property owner. They'd happened because no one had ever asked permission. That silence felt heavier than any argument. Then came the number. $8.2 million. That was the estimated value of the lake and surrounding land. When it was said out loud, the room went quiet. People finally understood the scale of the mistake. This wasn't a small oversight. It was a multimillion-dollar assumption that had lasted for years. The HOA president turned toward me and asked if I wanted to say anything. I stood, not to lecture, but to clarify. I told them I'd never tried to hide ownership. The records were public. I also explained that I'd allowed access informally because I believed in good neighbor relationships. What changed wasn't my ownership. What changed was entitlement crossing into enforcement. The room shifted again. Some residents nodded. Others looked toward the board with open frustration. The meeting ended without resolutions, but one thing was clear. The HOAS authority had hit a hard boundary, and it wasn't just legal. It was reputational. As I left, I knew the real consequences were only beginning. Within days of the meeting, the tone of every interaction in the neighborhood changed. The HOA stopped sending notices about the lake entirely, as if silence could erase years of overreach. The docks sat empty. The paddle boats were chained. Even the walking paths near the shoreline felt different, quieter, like everyone was afraid to step in the wrong place. That fear didn't come from me. It came from uncertainty, and uncertainty spreads fast when authority is exposed. The HOAS lawyer reached out first, requesting a formal discussion. Not a demand. Not a warning. A request. That alone spoke volumes. We met in his office, paperwork spread across a polished table, the same documents I'd mentioned to the police now sitting front and center. He confirmed what everyone already knew. The HOA had no legal claim. No easement. No access rights. Nothing. Years of use had created expectation, not entitlement. He explained the HOA's concern plainly. Liability. If someone got hurt on the lake, the HOA could be exposed. If they continued to claim authority over property they didn't own, the consequences could be worse. I listened carefully. This wasn't about punishment. It was about reality finally catching up. Word traveled quickly after that meeting. Residents began stopping me politely, some apologizing, others just trying to understand what would happen next. I told them the same thing every time. I wasn't interested in shutting the neighborhood out. I was interested in respect and clarity. Those two things had been missing for a long time. Behind closed doors, the HOA board struggled. Resignations were discussed. Fingers were pointed. The woman who had called the police quietly stepped down from her position, citing personal reasons. Everyone knew the truth. That phone call had cost the board its credibility. Then came the insurance issue. The HOA's provider dropped coverage related to the lake immediately after learning the facts. That single move forced action faster than any lawsuit could have. Without coverage, the HOA couldn't allow events, access, or maintenance. The lake went from community centerpiece to legal minefield overnight. I received one final letter from the HOA's attorney outlining their proposal. A formal access agreement. Clear terms. Written permission. Compensation. Boundaries defined in ink instead of assumption. It was the first document they'd ever produced that acknowledged reality instead of rewriting it. I didn't rush to respond. Fishing teaches patience. Big changes, like big catches, don't come from jerking the line too fast. The lake was still. The neighborhood was waiting. And for the first time, the power dynamic had completely reversed. What finally pushed everything into the open wasn't a letter or a meeting. It was a post. Someone in the neighborhood shared the story in a local community group, and within hours, it spread far beyond our streets. Screenshots of county records appeared. Photos of the lake followed. The headline people kept repeating was simple and shocking: the HOA never owned the lake. Not even close. Local blogs picked it up next. Then a regional news site ran a short piece about a homeowners association mistakenly calling police on a private landowner. They didn't use my name, but they didn't need to. Anyone in the neighborhood knew exactly who the story was about. What caught everyone's attention was the valuation. $8.2 million. That number turned an HOA dispute into a cautionary tale. Suddenly, the HOA board wasn't just answering to residents. They were answering to lawyers, insurers, and public opinion. Past decisions were questioned. Old meeting minutes were reviewed. Emails resurfaced. It became clear that several board members had known ownership was unclear but chose to assume control anyway. That phrase, pulled straight from an internal message, did real damage. Residents who had once supported strict enforcement started asking uncomfortable questions. Why were dues used to maintain property the HOA didn't own? Why were people fined for violating lake rules that had no legal basis? Why did it take a police call for the truth to come out? Those questions didn't have easy answers, and silence only made them louder. I stayed out of the spotlight as much as possible. I declined interviews. I didn't comment online. I kept fishing. That seemed to frustrate people the most. They wanted drama. What they got was consistency. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I was letting facts do their work. Behind the scenes, the HOA's legal costs climbed. Special assessments were proposed to cover expenses. That triggered backlash from homeowners who felt blindsided. Meetings grew tense. Voices were raised. Votes were contested. The board fractured under pressure, and 2 more members resigned before the month was over. The lake, meanwhile, became symbolic. It wasn't just water anymore. It represented unchecked authority and the danger of believing something long enough that you stop verifying it. People finally understood that ownership isn't about proximity or tradition. It's about records, boundaries, and respect. One evening, as I reeled in a fish and released it back into the water, a neighbor approached quietly. He thanked me. Not for owning the lake, but for forcing the truth into the open. That moment mattered more than any apology from the board ever could. By the time the HOA reached out again, their tone had completely shifted. There were no assumptions left, no authority implied, no threats hiding behind polite language. This time, they came prepared. A revised proposal arrived by certified mail, thick with legal language, diagrams, and clearly marked boundaries. It acknowledged my ownership in the first paragraph. That alone told me how far things had gone. The proposal outlined a formal access agreement. Limited use. Defined hours. Clear liability waivers. Insurance coverage paid entirely by the HOA. Compensation for past use, calculated carefully and conservatively, though the number was still enough to make the board uncomfortable. There were also clauses restricting enforcement. No HOA officer could approach me, question me, or call authorities regarding the lake without direct legal review. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. I took my time reviewing it with my own attorney. We adjusted language, tightened definitions, and added protections that should have existed from the start. This wasn't about squeezing the HOA. It was about ensuring the same mistake couldn't happen again. Authority without boundaries had caused the problem. Boundaries would prevent the next one. When the agreement was finalized, another meeting was called. This time, the room felt different. Quieter. Humbled. The HOA president explained the terms openly, leaving no room for confusion. Residents listened carefully, some relieved, others resentful, but everyone aware that the illusion was gone. The lake wasn't theirs. It was accessible by permission, not entitlement. The vote passed narrowly. Some homeowners stormed out, angry about fees and restrictions. Others stayed behind, grateful that access hadn't been lost entirely. No one argued about ownership anymore. That question was settled permanently. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me individually. Some apologized sincerely. Others admitted they'd always assumed the HOA exaggerated its authority but never imagined it could be that wrong. I accepted the apologies that felt real and let the rest go. Carrying resentment would only poison something I cared about. Within weeks, the lake came back to life, but differently. Signs went up explaining permitted use. Events were smaller. Rules were clearer. People asked before acting. That single change made all the difference. Respect returned where assumption once lived. One afternoon, I watched a group of kids fishing along the shore under the new agreement, laughing and cheering when one of them landed a catch. That moment reminded me why I hadn't shut the gates completely. Ownership isn't just control. It's responsibility. The HOA had learned its lesson the hard way, but the story wasn't finished yet. One final consequence remained, and it would define how this entire ordeal ended. Months later, the lake looked the same as it always had. The water still reflected the sky like glass. The fish still surfaced near dusk. From the outside, no one would guess what had happened here. But beneath that calm surface, everything had changed, and the change mattered far beyond this neighborhood. The final consequence came quietly. The HOA commissioned an external audit, something they'd never done before. The findings were blunt. Years of overreach. Poor record verification. Decisions based on assumption rather than documentation. The report recommended structural changes, mandatory legal reviews for enforcement actions, and limits on board authority. It also cited the police call as the defining failure, the moment where confidence turned into liability. The HOA president resigned shortly after the report was released. Not in disgrace, but in acknowledgement. A letter went out to all residents admitting fault and outlining reforms. For the first time, the HOA wasn't presenting itself as an unquestioned power, but as a service accountable to facts. That shift alone was worth everything that had happened. As for me, life returned to normal. I fished. I maintained the shoreline. I honored the agreement. The lake remained open, but only within the boundaries we'd all agreed to. People followed the rules more carefully now. Not because they were afraid of fines, but because they understood why rules existed in the first place. Every so often, I'd see a new resident walk down to the water, pause, and read the posted notice explaining ownership and access. That pause mattered. It meant the story had become part of the lake's identity. A reminder that beautiful things don't automatically belong to whoever is closest or loudest. They belong to whoever holds responsibility for them. The woman who made the call never approached me again. I heard she moved a year later. I don't hold that against her. She wasn't the cause. She was the symptom of a system that rewarded certainty without verification. Systems like that don't collapse all at once. They crack when someone finally refuses to step aside. Sometimes, as I cast my line, I think about how easily this could have gone differently. If I'd panicked. If I'd left. If I'd accepted authority that wasn't real. None of this would have changed. That's the real story here. Not the police. Not the HOA. Not even the $8.2 million lake. The story is about knowing what's yours, knowing your rights, and staying calm when someone tries to take them away with confidence instead of proof.